Welcome, everybody, to session 35 of Classic Metal Class. It's me and my good friend Scott, professor of guitar at Berklee School of Music. And we do these monthly. We're going to be exploring something that we've touched on a few times obliquely in the past, but never really got into discussion of. And it's kind of overdue, I would say, because we've looked at a number of regional scenes in the development of classic metal, so metal in the 70s and 80s. You know, we've looked at Great Britain in great depth. We actually had Ken, who's here, on to talk about what it was like growing up within the new wave of British heavy metal. We've talked about the United States, particularly the LA scene and all of that. We've talked about some other regional places like Germany or Japan, but we never got to the Nordic countries. And it's kind of a funny oversight because not only are they important in the, let's say, the classic metal period, but if you had to pick one region, not just right now, but for the past, I don't know, 30 years or so, where metal has laid down the deepest and widest roots and has the most new stuff developing, it would be arguably the Nordic countries. There are some really interesting stats out there, which I don't have, the full ones at the top of my head, but there's, within the Nordic countries. So we're talking about, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland. You can also include the Faroe Islands. There's a greater per capita number of bands than anywhere else in the world, metal bands, not just bands per se, but metal bands. And, you could say that in a way, this whole area provided, like Japan has in the past, a really needed economic reservoir for metal acts out there that may have kept some of them alive over the years, in the lean years, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. And so we're going to look at what happened in the 70s and 80s. We're looking at a time where heavy metal is actually, kind of confusing. What is it? We've talked about this a number of times. It's emerging as a musical genre and lifestyle and segment of the music industry. Bands are being influenced by each other. There's scenes growing up all over the world. And I'll throw something out there. And actually, I'd be interested to hear particularly what Jimmy has to say about this. There's stereotypes about Nordic metal, right? So, Norway, the home of black metal, Sweden, death metal, Denmark, melodic or power metal, and then what's Finland, maybe a mishmash of those. And we know that that's not the case at all. And when we look at the history of it, we see that there's a lot of confluence between these, and the story is a lot richer than just these genres, these subgenres of it. So we're going to be looking at each of the, we'll call them country scenes, and how they developed and sort of cross-influenced each other. And we're going to start with the smaller ones first. But we should say this. So, similar to what happened in the United States and in Britain, in Japan, in Germany, and also the Low Countries, a lot of what is happening in the 70s and 80s is stuff that isn't happening in the same way today. Because, obviously we have the internet, which has changed things. Scott has talked many times about how streaming has drastically altered the music scene and its economics. It was quite important to be able to produce records, to go on tours, to get featured in, shows on the radio, that sort of stuff. And, we can talk about those important elements. I think there's a couple other features that are quite important as well. And some of it has to do with educational systems, music education, which is kind of spotty here in the United States. it's very much a patchwork. Some places really great, other places, it's basically you're on your own, kid. Get yourself a guitar and try to learn it. I think the educational systems played a role in supporting people, wanting to learn music. And then, it's interesting also to think about the importance of the English language, as opposed to, say, France, where, you have metal bands, although not a lot of them, and they're singing primarily just in French or Spanish. Think about Baron Roja, right, or Sortilège in France. English is a lingua franca, and there are some bands that are singing in, say, Finnish or Swedish or stuff like that. But if you want to make it, it's sort of like how the Scorpions, when we looked at them, they were like, well, we don't know English very well, but we're going to have to do this in English in order to get worldwide distribution. So that's sort of a preface. Scott, what do you want to add? And then, anybody who wants to weigh in, what do you want to say about this developing scene? I know Scott and I have been listening just to prep for this to a lot of these bands that we're going to talk about. So I already talked a lot. Scott, you take the stage.
Well, my first guess, and Jimmy can answer this much better, but my first guess is the music itself, getting to different places. I mean, you remember, you and I always talk about the Japanese imports that we used to get back in the 80s.
Yeah.
That you couldn't get in this country. So I think, being influenced by music from different places, hearing it, aspiring to be sort of like that, and then developing your own thing out of it. It needs some kind of, like, the music education is important, but that normally is not aligned with style or genre. It's more like maybe the awareness of some stuff, but to pique the interest of somebody in the beginning, where I think, for me, it was seeing the rock bands when I was a kid and knowing that's what I wanted to do. I imagine anywhere it would start there. It would start with hearing music getting exposed in different places.
Yeah, I think music education, we could say, plays a role in honing people's talents and enabling them, right? Rather than, because music education almost always lags behind whatever is happening in the popular culture. I remember back in middle school, so this would be like early 80s, now the contemporary stuff that we had to sing for music class was like Lionel Richie, stuff like that. Sang Lady and I can't remember the others, but we also had to sing the whole friggin' album of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band because my music teacher was super, super into it. And she thought she was like introducing us to cool, she didn't say new stuff, but like, this is something that's not just the old stuff that we were doing before. This is, more, I don't know, more poppy, right? And we were like, come on, lady, this is what our parents listened to. So I imagine that music education does something kind of like that. It's not by itself going to introduce you to the cool new stuff that's out there, right? That has to happen by hearing bands on the radio with records, your dirtbag friend's older brother who's playing something that you listen to, right? So, but the two of them can kind of go together, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, music education piques your interest and kind of gets. I notice, when I meet younger people, if they've had like a music education, just kind of the baseline of what they understand or how good their ears are, or as the baseline.
Do you think that it I don't want to stay on this topic too long, but do you think, as a music educator who sees the effects of previous music education, that it kind of speeds up the process or gives people, I won't say shortcuts as such, because that sounds like they're, not doing the work, but that it makes it easier for you to be like, okay, I know I'm hearing this. I can recognize what's going on. I want to do something like this. Let me get out my bass, my guitar. Let me think about vocals or stuff like that.
Oh yeah. And it's funny because, I don't know scientifically, but anybody that started violin at age 4, just about all of them have perfect pitch. When somebody has perfect pitch in one of my classes, I said, when did you start music? It's like 4 or 5 years old. And, but I mean, there's a level of technique on the instrument, whether it's, and so, yeah, I mean, from there, they have the ears, they have the musicianship, and then kind of learning the other stuff. They've already got a baseline technique. They've got, I mean, I think all of that is very important. I just think if we're talking about heavy metal or metal in general, that's the bug I think we get hit with. For me, it was the Les Paul through a Marshall. It was just that sonic hit. And I was taking lessons when I was younger, but I did get started as a kid, hearing Def Leppard's Pyromania and stuff like that, thinking, wow, what the heck is this? What's going on? What is this? This is new to me, so.
So Andy has an interesting comment here. Back when we were in grade school and middle school, music education was much more about singing songs in a class together, sort of like pop culture chorus. I feel like real musical education now is much more than just exposure. It connects with more technical aspects of music. But I also think that due to technology, exposure is much different. Back then, we were singing the things the teachers had in their own album collections. It was the 70s and very early 80s, after all. And I think that's right. What do you think, Scott?
I think as far as the technology bit, I kind of argue that, or I've kind of found that, like a lot of my students, they don't know that much music. If I ask them the bands they listen to, there's like 3 bands on the list, and it's what everybody else is listening to. And it's not, I mean, we would hear what the older brother was listening to, or your friend would put on an album you didn't hear, and then you'd want your own copy. Or just when I was touring in my early 20s, it was trading cassettes or trading CDs, and it was like a lot of different music. I ask students now, so like a row of very well-known guitar players through history. I'll even ask them, who's a guitarist of U2? Who's a guitarist of the Police? Who's the lead guitarist of the Beatles? Who's Peter Frampton? And I'll get like 9 out of 10 I don't knows.
Wow.
They'll know who's on the G3 tour, and they'll know there's a few players now that are like the new wave of what they call math rock.
Okay.
But I just feel like they have access to more stuff, but it doesn't mean they're looking for it. It doesn't mean they're listening to it.
So Ken has an interesting remark, but before we look at that, I want to bring up something else that came out in doing the research on this. It's really clear that demo records, demo tapes were massively important for a lot of these bands. There was, they would circulate around. People would try to get a hold of them. Quite a few would sell out, and you couldn't get them. And then, you have to like find somebody who would dub it for you. And I think that's something that we saw. You talk about tape trading. That was something that we saw a lot of in the 80s, Now, Ken says education can also attempt to be suppressive of anything seen as counterculture. For an early singing assignment, I chose to try to sing Dreamer Deceiver by Priest and was promptly thrown out of the class for singing devil music. It's funny, too, because, I mean, there was stuff that could be devil music at the time, right? It's not like you were singing, Black Sabbath, or, I mean, what would be a good example of a band where it's like deliberately about the devil? Dreamer Deceiver is, I mean, there is a kind of new agey or like, what would you call it? I mean, the lyrics are about this cosmic consciousness, right? So it's definitely not devil music. But, yeah, I could see how it could be countercultural, and that's probably true. I wonder, we could say that maybe some music education is attempting to like be repressive, right? To restrict people to, here's the good music, the other stuff is all crap.
Yeah, but I think with those of us that are metalheads, that's the rebellion part.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, heavy metal is by its nature transgressive, right? And when it becomes non-transgressive, it's debatable whether it's really that metal anymore, right? But let's talk about some bands. So I wanted to start by talking about Iceland, in part because there wasn't much going on there, and so we can get it out of the way very quickly. There is a big metal scene contemporary in Iceland, but the 70s and 80s just were not a good time for that. The scene was pretty dominated first by disco in the 70s, later on in the late 70s, early 80s, punk and new wave. There was one band called Start that was kind of a mix of hard rock and heavy metal. And it turned out there was like a conflict within the band. The younger members wanted to play metal, and the older members wanted it to be more traditional hard rock. And they toured around in the early 80s. They actually played at Rock in Reykjavik and released an album. Unfortunately, unfortunately, this is kind of a judgment call. At least as far as dissemination, it's unfortunate that they chose to have the lyrics be in Icelandic because, nobody else was really going to be listening to it. But they released this album in 1981, and by 84, they're gone. So there isn't much of an Icelandic scene. I think the next country to look at is Denmark. And there we have a very different sort of thing going on. There's a lot more bands. A lot of them are like occult or dark theme bands. That's one side of it. There's also what we could call, and I'll use this phrase, and I'd be curious to see what people make of this. So we talk about the new wave of British heavy metal, right? And it's clear that the stuff that was going on in the new wave of British heavy metal didn't just impact Britain. It had a huge impact in other places. And there's bands where if you didn't know that they were from a particular country that's not Britain, you could be like, well, that's a new wave of British heavy metal band. So think about Riot in New York in the late 70s, early 80s. You could think of one of the bands we're going to talk about later, Torch. So there's Danish bands that basically seem to be, they're not part of the new wave of British heavy metal because they're not British, but they've got that ethos. They've got that, like, let's speed it up. Let's make it heavier and harder. And then you've got these hard rock melodic bands. So those are like the landscape in the 70s and 80s. So Ken has a good example. Armored Saint, perfect example of a new wave of British heavy metal band who weren't from the UK, from LA, I think, right? Does that sound right, Scott?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I could see them as being in that spectrum, right? So the huge elephant in the room is Mercyful Fate. And they start out in 1980. They end up with this lineup that includes this guy, King Diamond, on vocals. They got this guy, Hank Sherman, on lead and rhythm guitars, Michael Denner also on that, Timmy Hansen on bass, and Kim Ruz on drums. So you got, traditional 5-piece, sort of like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden or so many other bands we could think of. Mercyful Fate is contributing to the first wave of black metal, along with Venom and Bathory. And they actually, they have a claim to fame over here in the United States. which is they're listed in the filthy 15, right? They're the only, I think, Nordic band listed or that the PMRC actually took notice of. And, you know, they tour around. They start out in their home country of Denmark, and then they tour in Germany, which makes sense because it's just to the south. They tour the Low Countries. They make it over to the US, which is a sign that they've got a much bigger distribution. And then they break up in 1985 after releasing two really great albums, Melissa and Don't Break the Oath, that I think probably a lot of us heard or had back in the day, right? And so we're going to get two bands that are going to come out of this. One of them, and so this is really quite interesting. They're going in different directions, right? What are the different directions? One of them is to go the sort of melodic AOR way. There's this band Fate. They get a record deal within weeks just on the basis. So it's Hank Sherman, and he gets a deal within weeks, adds some new players, including a keyboard player. And he's going to leave after their second album. And, you know, their stuff, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to them, Scott, but I mean, is it metal? Yeah, it's kind of metal. I don't know how much you want to call it that. It's definitely hard rock. And so they have Fate, you know, self-titled debut in 85, Matter of Attitude in 86, Cruising for a Bruisin' in 88. And, you know, they like keyboards a lot. They really do a lot of ballads. So, you know, is that within the metal spectrum? For the time, I would say yes. I mean, if we want to consider, you know, a lot of the bands that we classify as glam metal within the spectrum, and they just kind of peter out. King Diamond, on the other hand, you know, that's a whole different story. So King Diamond, he keeps Michael Denner and Timmy Hansen. They are massively important. I remember my sister was super into them. I myself couldn't get all that into the falsetto lyrics. But you know, the music was hard and heavy and all of that. And, you know, we see that Mickey D played with them for a while, who, you know, now is, I think, with the Scorpions as their drummer. He was with Motorhead for a long time. And they put out some really great albums as well. Fatal Portrait, Abigail, Them, Conspiracy. Those are all the stuff from the 80s. So, you know,
it's good to note too, not to interrupt, but
yeah, no, go ahead.
Diamond is extremely theatrical. I mean,
that's another important point. Yeah.
I think the albums were stories, and the shows were kind of, you know, the set for the shows were, I mean, I love the music, but on top of it, you go, when you go, there's an experience. I mean,
yeah.
What's King Diamond's real name? I mean, I saw him interviewed once that he said that's his real name, you know, and, you know, King and Diamond. And, you know, he kind of kept that on, you know, he kind of, you know, next step Kiss, you know, on the whole image, the world that he invited people into. I think that was key.
You read stuff from the time, talking about the face painting, both with King Diamond and then with like, some of the death and black metal bands, right? And they're like, these guys are doing something very different than Kiss or Alice Cooper was with their paint, you know? And you're right. Yeah. I wonder, this is pure speculation. So they don't just do a concept album. They do several concept albums. I wonder if them doing that and being successful made it more possible for a band like Queensryche to do Operation Mindcrime. Now, this is a big leap. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, Mindcrime's a masterpiece. So I don't know, because if Mindcrime wasn't a
proof of concept, it shows you can do it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, but something tells me if I were to try to copy it because I was inspired by it, it wouldn't be as good as Mindcrime. I mean, to like... I'd be interested to see if there's any interviews with Jeff Tate back then, or Scott, or
that would have been a good thing for us to research.
we We just thought of it now.
Yeah. So there's a number of other really interesting bands. Pretty Maids is one of those out there. They started in 81. They started as Pretty Panic, and then they have a few lineup changes over the years. Their EP is in 83, and then one that I really recommend is Red Hot and Heavy. That's from 84. That's pretty good. Future World 87. They did a lot of touring with other metal bands, did Monsters of Rock in Germany in 87. So they're an important feature there. Jimmy says Pretty Maids, very familiar. Yeah. So, and then I really liked this band that I hadn't heard of before, Witchcross. I would say that they sound like a new wave of British heavy metal band. So they put out Fit for Fight in 84. They tour throughout Europe, and then just like so many other bands, particularly bands of the new wave of British heavy metal, think about Diamond Head, for example. Bad management, things don't work out, and they end up, just kind of foundering. They don't produce another album, and you look at that and you're like, oh man, at least no new album in that time. Some of these bands have subsequently gotten back together and released stuff in the 2000s. There was another interesting band called Maltese Falcon that formed in 83. They started performing on Danish radio in 84. They had an album called Metal Rush, and then by 86, they're disbanded. Another one that is worth noting is Hero. They're a bit more melodic and glammy. They use keyboards quite a bit. But they can be heavy at points. They form in 84. So you can tell the early 80s are a pretty important time. They have one album that they've managed to bring out, self-titled Hero. And then they split up in 88, which seems to be a kind of common theme. The other Danish band, and I'd be interested if anybody else knows of other bands that we should have talked about here, is a more punkish band, Red Warszawa, who are inspired by Polish punk bands. They don't manage to put out any albums until the 90s, but they have some real traction there, and they're singing in Danish, and their ethos is being sort of like low class and uneducated, crass, proud of it. So pretty punk mentality. Although I think there's a lot of metal bands put forth that kind of ethos as well. And they sing about that kind of stuff: alcoholism, prostitution, drug abuse. So Jimmy says, here's the Pretty Maids best of: Future World, Savage Heart, Please Don't Leave Me, Little Drops of Heaven, and the whole Jump the Gun record. So yeah, some good recommendations there.
Nice.
So, I mean, I think that's an encapsulation of the Danish scene. Which of the bands did you get a chance to listen to, Scott?
I listened to, there's some I was familiar with in this whole thing.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of Mercyful Fate?
Well, see, I didn't have to do, I already familiar with them.
Yeah.
I listened to like a track from Maltese Falcon. On this one, on the we're talking about the Danish stuff. I was already familiar with King Diamond, but now I'm gonna have to dig into Pretty Maids because of Jimmy. I didn't listen to any of that stuff, but now Jimmy's got some recommendations. That's awesome.
I really like that Witchcross album, Fit for Fight. Oh, Ken says Heavy Load definitely deserve a mention, and we will be mentioning them, but in a different country. So let's move on to the Finns. So now Denmark, you've got a music industry that's pretty, solid. It's interesting to see what's going on with Finland in Finnish bands, because you don't have as developed of a music industry. You do have places to play, you have radio stations, but we're going to see a close connection between Finland and Sweden. And in the case of the second main band to come out of there, Britain, as well. So the first band that, and of course we're leaving out a lot of people who made an impact, but it was kind of forgotten. There's this band Sarcofagus, and they're a progressive metal band, singing in Finnish. They actually had a female vocalist on some of their tracks, and they're founded in 1977, which is not a great time for, it's a great time for some heavy metal in some places, but not in Finland. They have a couple albums that they put out, Cycle of Life and Envoy of Death in 1980, Motor Inulut in 1982. And it's interesting because their guitarist, Kimmo, and I'm sure I'm mangling his name, Kunisimi, he becomes like a spokesperson for Finnish heavy metal. He starts this Finnish Heavy Metal Association to bring together Finnish fans. He's an advocate for getting heavy metal on the radio and in TV, doing interviews and newspapers. And he's like the go-to guy to explain metal and its philosophy to reporters who probably, at the time, you think about late 70s, early 80s, they're like, what the hell is this? They're so loud, the kids are angry, and what is this crap, right? So it's kind of, there's a bit of a success story that comes out of that, and then it's just not the time. And then the next big band is one that I think all of us know about, in part because of the huge scandal with their drummer dying in a car with Vince Neil, all drunk, crashing the car, which kind of, derailed them. And that's Hanoi Rocks. They're formed in 79, and they've got a lot of different members at first, and eventually they settle on a good lineup. And they move to Stockholm. This is a kind of common theme. Why do they move to Stockholm? Because it's easier to record and distribute and connect. And then they go on this 102-day tour throughout Finland and Sweden, beginning in January 1981, which is, according to what people say, the longest rock tour in Finnish history. 102 days, that's a long time to be on the road. And they're going to, move to London in 81 to record, then back to Finland. They start, this is another really interesting thing. They start in 82 recording music videos. And then they hire this guy, Razzle, who's a fan of Hanoi Rocks. He goes up to them at a concert and he's like, I want to play with you guys. He becomes the drummer. And they are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's one thing to do a tour of the US. They tour Asia. They don't just go to Japan. They go to Hong Kong. They go to Bombay. So these guys are really, really making it. And you could say, there's a lot of bad things you could say about the guys from Motley Crue, but probably the most damning thing would be, what could this band have been if Vince Neil hadn't been, in his party lifestyle and gotten this guy Razzle killed? Because that is what kills the band. They're incredibly prolific. They've got 2 albums in 82, 1 in 81, 1 in 83, 1 in 84. That's incredible production for a band that's on the road all the time. So, what do you think about that, Scott?
I love the band, but yeah, I just I didn't know that for a long time. I didn't know that derailed the band. I didn't know about the crash, and you think I would have heard about it at the time. It wasn't until years later.
It was like in Circus and Hit Parader, and
I know.
Yeah,
I know. It would have been everywhere. But no, great band. Killer band. Glammy in a cool way. I think they weren't they on tour? Were they on tour with?
Yeah, American tour. Yeah.
So they were. Yeah. So that's how they started hanging out. But yeah, it's a tragedy. But it's pretty impressive about the the that tour being like the 102-day tour being one in Finnish history. That's news to me. I saw that in the notes. I also wanted to point out some stuff that weren't in the notes. Bands that I love that Jimmy had mentioned: Nightwish, Children of Bodom. Those are great albums that they make. We're going to talk about some of the other ones too.
Stratovarius,
but
we'll get to them.
Yes, but I didn't know Nightwish. I didn't know those two bands were Finnish bands, actually. Children of Bodom. They're great albums, though. They're great.
Yeah, and we should mention too, we deliberately restricted ourselves to 70s and 80s as a strategic decision. So we're leaving quite a few bands out.
Yeah.
Because if we wanted to do justice to metal in the Nordic countries from the say 1990 onward, Scott and I would have to be here for a couple days because there's just so many bands.
And we've talked about Ghost before.
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
Well, the next. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say where we more or less established the cutoff was, with a few exceptions, did you put out an album by 1989?
Gotcha. Yeah, exactly.
But it's a sign of just how deep and wide the culture goes in these countries, as opposed to say the US where, we've talked about this quite a bit before. Did grunge effectively displace metal? Well, not just on its own talents. It was also because, as Scott has pointed out, MTV, kind of made a strategic decision there, what to push, what to not push. But there were definitely some serious lean years for metal bands in the US and arguably even in Britain too in the 90s. Whereas, that's like an era of incredible proliferation in the Nordic countries,
Yeah. But I was going to say next up was one of my favorite listens.
Oz.
Yeah.
I've been listening to them for a long time. They're one of those ones that when I first heard them, I thought they were a new wave of British heavy metal band. Before
I was going to say the stuff that I heard, and I don't want to say they're copying, but it reminded me of early Saxon and early Maiden.
Yeah, I'd say that's right.
And the music's great. The riffs are great. I'm like, I don't know. The dates are often not right because they could be reissues. So I'm not sure when the albums came out that I heard, but were they? When did they?
The albums they had in their classic period were Heavy Metal Heroes in 82, Fire in the Brain, which I think is the one that put them on the map in 83, Ill Warning 84, Decibel Storm in 86, and then after that it's changing, right? So this guy Jay Blade, he'd gotten kicked out of Sarcofagus and he joins the band. And he's pretty important in it, but then he goes to New York to fill in on this 4-gig tour with Princess Pang. When he comes back, he says, "Hey, I want to join this other band," and so that's the end of that first period. Now they're still around touring, but it's not. It is the same band and it's not the same band, right?
Right.
But I think they're really great. If I had to pick just one Finnish band that I would listen to, it'd be them.
From that era, I agree.
Yeah,
because the stuff that I heard was all great. It was like sometimes we say there's fillers on albums.
Yeah, the Thriller, killer to filler ratio.
That's right, killer to filler ratio.
Yeah.
It was which it is interesting because we had talked about that before about kind of a way of being contempt to the fans if you buy an album and there's like 3 killer things and then some silly goofy songs
Yeah,
and then some you know static noise for a track, or but then when you get something that's solid from start to finish, you feel like back then when we were buying records, that we felt like we got our money's worth.
Here's an interesting remark from Ken. I think in many ways, Oz picked up the torch from new wave of British heavy metal and helped to propagate what's now called traditional heavy metal. Very influential band. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, because like I said, the early, those are 2 British bands that I had mentioned, their early stuff that I wouldn't say they were copying. It was reminiscent of it. It gave me that vibe, that feel of early Saxon, which I love. I love early Saxon, like Denim and Leather.
The other thing that we should say about them too is because this is going to play a role in the story of the next band we're going to look at. So Oz deliberately moves to Sweden, and that was probably a good business decision for them. So let's look at a band that unfortunately didn't, and it may have actually caused problems with getting wider traction, and that's Riff Raff, who are also very fun. They've got, a couple albums in the early 80s, No Law and Order and Robot Stud in 1982, which has some crazy album covers. Give the Dead Man Some Water in 1983. And they were one of these bands that got a lot of national press. They were heavy. They were a lot of fun, but they also had management issues. They chose not to move to Sweden, and they had difficulty getting traction and ended up breaking up, by 84. Stratovarius got mentioned. So they're emerging a bit later, formed in 84 as Black Water. Then they disband in 85 and reform as Stratovarius with a new lineup, but they don't put their first album out until 1989, and that's Fright Night. But massively influential on power metal, which is emerging, in the 90s as a genre. Tarot is another one that we should mention. They're a heavy metal band who will eventually shift to more power metal. I like their stuff quite a bit. They have an album, Spell of Iron, in 86, and Follow Me Into Madness in 88. And you can tell their transition because they add a keyboardist in between, right? So it's a slightly different sound. And then the last of the Finnish bands that I actually listened to them, and then I was like, Scott, you got to check this stuff out, was this thrash metal band called Stone. And they emerged in 85, and they get noticed by a lot of people. They get a record deal with this Megamania. They release a self-titled album in 88, and then No Anesthesia in 1989. And they're funny because they do parodies of other people's stuff on their albums, so they're an interesting band to take a look at as well, I would say. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive. I do remember you mentioning, and I heard just bits and pieces. There's some stuff that I scratched through just because there was so much stuff.
Yeah.
But now with that kind of introduction with the kind of parody stuff, that's unique. That's kind of unique with the thrash metal kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd say that's quite true. When you can make fun of another band's stuff, and what are they making fun of? It's actually Europe's Final Countdown.
Oh, did they really?
Yeah, you know how like you see Facebook Reels and they'll have music and it gets like down tuned a little bit and maybe like put into a slower tempo and minor key.
Oh,
so
yeah.
it sounds kind of pathetic. That's what they do to the intro stuff. It's only like a minute and a half long of the final countdown, which is this majestic,
Yeah, right.
we all know that riff, right?
Yeah.
So they down tune it and they make it sound kind of pathetic.
Oh, I always wondered how out of all of Europe's stuff that became what they're known for. Like everybody knows that.
Yeah.
That keyboard intro. But like at the time, I would have never guessed that would be the one the thing that they'd be remembered as. I don't know how you thought, just off subject. Well, they're a Swedish band anyway.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was a triumphant sounding intro. But who would know that decades later that would be like their.
I think there's some parallels. I mean, think about like Warrant and their song Cherry Pie, right? Which was filler. It was done because they needed one more song to like plump out the album, and they put it in there, and it became like their biggest hit that they have to play every time that they play. And after a while they hated it, because it was the one thing that everybody knew them for. What would be some other similar, like, this is the way this band sounds, and it's just one song?
Well, it would be the Guns N' Roses "Sweet Child of Mine" riff.
Oh yeah, okay.
And speaking of, Jimmy, Hanoi Rock said to inspire Guns N' Roses. Jimmy knows a lot of these people we're talking about, actually, personally.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that. I mean, I guess it would make sense that Guns N' Roses might take the cue from Hanoi Rock. So,
yeah, I mean, they're an interesting one, right? Because most of these other bands, they're having some impact outside of Denmark per se, but Hanoi Rocks really did have an international presence, I think you can say.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we knew them here. I mean, I knew them before I knew where they were from.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I don't think we were generally aware that they were not an American band.
I thought they might have been a New York band, actually. Which would have kind of made sense at the time, but yeah.
Well, let's shift over slightly. We'll come back to Sweden. So we're pretending like we're going across the border in the north into Norway. And we're getting to places that have more and more bands, and at least in this era, right? Mm-hmm. So Norway has a pretty strong prog rock scene in the 70s. And some of that stuff could be pretty hard and heavy. So you've got a band, Høst, that is singing in Norwegian. They have an album that's making some traction in 74. In the 70s, later 70s, punk becomes popular. And then you've got these hard rock / heavy metal bands that are emerging. And the first of them is Rokefire. And they managed to bring out a single in 81, and it's got, two sides to it. So Heavy Boys Don't Cry and the Island of Marat. They're having some influence, but they're not really able to get the traction that they want. Probably one that is big early on is Arch. You see them mentioned quite a bit. Some of the other bands tour with them, and they're formed in 83. And then they start adding members, and they managed to release 2 albums. Interestingly, their albums are with Metal Blade. So they're getting international, what would you call it, distribution, right? They've got Time Waits for No One and Another Return. We also do see some metal bands that don't really make it, and they could have. One of them is Neon Night, formed in 84. They managed to release a demo in 84 and the self-titled album in 87, but then they split up in 87. So it doesn't work out for them. There was a metal punk band called Metal Rats who formed in 83 and released a demo in 85. So, there's stuff percolating. And then we get, it starts splitting off in different directions. So we have the glammy hard rock, could be metal, lots of power ballads. And there's 4 bands that are worth mentioning there. And they get started in the early 80s. So Return forms in 1980. They actually became one of the best-selling Norwegian bands of their time. But they don't actually put out albums until the late 80s. And they have 3 to the top attitudes and straight down the line in, 1 year after the other. TNT is a big one. Formed in 82. They actually have an American vocalist when they're breaking out. You got a chance to listen to them, I'm guessing?
Oh, I've listened to them for years. I love Tony Harnell.
Yeah. So, their first album had some Norwegian lyrics, and then I guess they were like, yeah, we gotta make some money here, get some distribution. 1984, Knights of the New Thunder. That's a pretty good album. 1987, Tell No Lies. 1989, Intuition. And they're touring all over the place too,
And in the last 10 years, they still make really good albums. I know we're talking about the past, but like they're one of the things that continue on to that. The songs are really great, and they're one of those bands that we talk about when we did that episode on long-term bands and what they're doing now and who we thought was making good stuff. TNT would go into the list of stuff that I think continuously still makes good music.
Not with them, but with some of these other bands that we're looking at, and not just in the Nordic countries, but in other places. This is a total digression. It's interesting to think about what if these bands in the 70s or 80s actually had access to like a good producer, a great studio, equipment that was much more reliable for recording and producing and stuff like that. What would they have sounded like on some of these albums? And it could even be with like big bands. I mean, you think about the complaints about Black Sabbath's 1983 Born Again, which I thought was a great album, but the production on it is not good, It's been subsequently re-released in some versions somewhere with like boosted production, but you think, wow, what could have been the case for some of these bands?
Yeah, the whole budget thing back then. The albums that we say that sounded like they had the 2 a.m. to 9 a.m. slot to record the whole album.
Yeah. Some of these bands, when you look into their history, like their first album will be produced in the course of like 2 days. Not produced, recorded.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you're like, wow, how the hell did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of it too is you hear mistakes on the album. They're subtle, but you hear them, and it's stuff that didn't bother us at the time at all. We didn't think twice about it. That now wouldn't happen. It would be fixed.
Do you think that contemporary audiences, and I'm thinking more of like younger people who didn't grow up hearing that sort of stuff, that there's less tolerance for those sorts of mistakes, or
no, because I don't think I don't know of an album that was released under a major label or whatever, something that we would have gotten the record store has mistakes that are so loud. We're talking about like a little fret buzz that would never pass these days, or a note slightly out of tune but not noticeable that would never pass these days. I mean, I've been in sessions where people will obsess over the smallest things. They'd rather have a take that was correct than one with a good vibe to it.
Yeah.
And when I produce, not engineer, but when I produce, I try to keep, within reason, stuff, as long as the execution would rile somebody up because it was played so well.
I mean, that did become a problem for some bands, even in like the 80s, where they had a ton of money because they are successful, and now they do become obsessive. It takes them forever to get the album actually out, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question for Jimmy too, because he's a big time producer. Jimmy, what do you think? Like if we go back to the old albums, the stuff that wasn't tolerated, that was tolerated back then, isn't tolerated right now. And like, to what degree do you experience some of the bands you produce about perfection? I'm kind of curious. Jimmy just did the new Giant album, and they're a Nashville band actually back in the day, but that's a really good question about. I haven't had any complaints where I've played something for somebody that's younger and they go, "Oh, there's a mistake there."
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's but I guess it's like when we used to listen to old stuff from the 50s, that maybe our parents listened to. Sometimes there was mistakes, but it wasn't. It didn't turn me off, but I noticed it because they would be around one microphone playing, and whatever take was the best one was kept, no matter.
Yeah, I mean, and the older the stuff gets, I mean, you go back to things from the 50s and early 60s, and in some records, the bass, you can't make out what the hell the bass is actually doing. It's just like thump, 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 thump.
Right.
But we are okay with it.
That's true. Yeah, right, and the way things are EQ'd, and I mean, there's definitely trends, but there's something to be said for that around the microphone thing.
I mean, Ken points out, and I think this is quite right, common story for many bands in their early phase: lots of enthusiasm, very little money, equals an unfortunately poor production. And I think in some cases we're like, yeah, okay, it's not as good as it should be, or like, what the hell happened there? Again, with like Black Sabbath's Born Again, where they're not a new band or anything, right? In a few cases, it actually works out serendipitously. I'm mispronouncing it. Like, Venom, their early albums, the production is notoriously bad, but that's part of what helps to spawn black metal, this notion that, well, you don't have to have high production, and it might actually be better if it sounds like it's recorded in somebody's garage, So Jimmy has an answer. You want to read it, Scott?
Yeah, I think the tolerance nowadays won't allow too many mistakes compared to 35 years ago. But even back, they were so well arranged that people had their shit before the studio. Yeah, that's true. You could actually hear very real mistakes, even if they were made in a few days. Yeah, so like the point is they were playing so many club dates that the band was so tight by the time they got into the studio, that there was an actual performance in fire in that album. But why not go back to try to make a commercially successful record in a week or 10 days? That would be something. Why not go back and that happened in some cases. Also worked out for Maiden. Oh, that's right. The producer wasn't interested, which is why Steve got to do the production work. Interesting.
Yeah, and we noticed too. So this is sort of not just a Nordic thing. This is kind of a universal thing. There's a lot of metal musicians who start out just playing, and they don't know much about production or the soundboards or stuff like that. But as time goes on, they're paying attention, and they start to take more and more and more initiative and control over it, and pay very close attention to how things are sounding,
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole discrepancy is, you've heard me say some people nowadays have a different definition of perfection than I do. Where theirs could be measured.
Do you think this goes to what Jimmy says here? We're spoiled with time and technical advantages because we have all this great technology, which doesn't require, super brains to use.
Right.
That it creates a kind of what would you call it? Like a false conception of perfection.
For some, that depends. I mean, you could still get a great band in the studio and get a great performance. I think sometimes the tools are overused for people that might have not so much talent or not so much experience.
Yeah.
And you could take something pretty raw and very rough and clean it up with technology. So, I guess for me, I would be able to tell. Maybe the common person wouldn't know, but I think they would know in the sense where they would feel it or not. They would feel a performance or not.
Yeah. So Jimmy says we're slow as turtles nowadays. Yeah. I suppose there's all the time in the world right now.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
That's an interesting thing to observe though, right? I mean, so think about all of this stuff happening. And Scott has pointed this out before in terms of rock and roll itself, but think about heavy metal. So you're part of a scene and things are really taking off. You don't have an internet. It's all, whatever makes it onto the radio, TV, tapes, what Clubs, you hear at a club. Yeah. And what makes it into the what magazines there are, right? And if you get any traction whatsoever, you must kind of feel like, we got to get on this now. We got to get a demo out. We got to get stuff circulating around. Whereas nowadays, I mean, metal's been around. If we want to say that the official starting date is 1970, then we've got 55 years. That's a very different time frame,
Yes.
The tempo is kind of different. The urgency, right?
Yeah.
So Mark has something interesting. I'd particularly like to get your take on this, Scott, because I know you have some takes on some of the examples of this. I love the lo-fi sound of older albums. I'm not a fan of these remastered releases. To me, they sound like the texture's been polished off, but I understand why as an artist you'd want a second bite at the apple.
So the remaster has everything to do with how it was remastered. Some of them, like the Iron Maiden ones that were done, they just made them into white noise. They just wanted those albums to be loud, so they took all the dynamic range out of them. However, there's some albums that were really well remastered. You hear details that you couldn't hear before. And some of the stuff that went to CD at the time in the 80s sounded amazing. Some of it was just from the record master. So I mean, it depends on, like we have to talk about specific ones. Some of them were made it worse. I agree. Some of the remasters made the albums worse. Some of them made it like, wow, I never heard that before. Or the reverb now is not too much. It sounds a little bit more balanced. It depends on who's doing it, the budget, and if they're really making a conscious effort, not just to make somebody buy the album again. Making the album loud was a thing. If you listen, I forgot, it was maybe the ones in the late 90s they remastered, and when Bruce Dickinson's voice came in, the snare disappeared because they squashed it so much. And because the more you squash it, the louder it gets. But it was just pretty much white noise, and there was like this much space for the music, and so it couldn't all exist in this space. So in that case, they were better off with the original, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, another famous example of that is Metallica's "And Justice for All," where, I mean, admittedly, Jason Newsted was a new guy on the block, right? He was great in Flotsam and Jetsam, but James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich, they were totally in control of stuff, and the bass disappeared essentially. Whereas, would Cliff Burton have let him get away with that stuff? No way. So Ken says, those early Loudness Wars remasters were eventually heavily criticized by Maiden themselves. Steve has mentioned several times they're a bad idea. I've seen that in the press
you know what?
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Ken. I didn't realize that. That actually makes me happy that he went back and listened and said this isn't right. Yeah. And because they remastered them again after that, and they're much better.
Yeah, it's funny, I want to get back to the band discussion, but we're
Sure.
kind of, if we're using electronic media to listen to stuff, we're kind of held captive to whoever wants to produce a remaster, right? Because you've got like Apple Music, your stuff is all in the cloud, even if it's
Yeah.
on your computer. If a new version of it comes out, it'll
Yeah.
download, you won't even know it, and you'll be like, what the hell is this, like I had Judas Priest's Rock-a-Rolla album, and it's really hard to find. And the reason I had the Rock-a-Rolla album is I also had Metal Killers Collection Volume
Yeah.
1, which had that was one of the anthologized songs, and the version of it that I had seems to be longer and not as harmonica based as the one that Apple Music has basically forced down my throat. And I've looked all over the place to see if I can find like the one that I remember from my youth playing on the actual disc, so I know it existed. And it seems almost impossible to find. And you're like, what the hell? I mean, it's a very trivial thing, right? My life is not ruined because I can't listen to the original.
Well, it is important. It means you have standards,
I guess so. Yeah. In some respect, right?
Yeah. Something just to go back on something that was up next that I think we were going to talk about was a big shock to me. The Stage Dolls.
Oh yeah.
I saw them in '89 with Blue Murder with John Sykes's band. I had no idea they weren't I thought they were from Los Angeles.
Okay. I wonder if some of these bands, this is total conjecture again, when they were touring in the 80s, if they managed to get over to the US, if they kind of just downplayed the fact that they weren't from the US or Britain, because those are the places in Germany that were really associated with heavy metal. Nobody was like, yeah, I'm gonna listen to this great new Norwegian band because that's the place where it's blossoming. I wonder if that was part of it. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it could have been I was young and I just assumed they're singing in English. It didn't sound like there was an accent when they sang, and I'm trying to think if I don't remember that.
Like with the Scorpions, right? Klaus Meine opens his mouth, he's German, or Udo,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was the best, and especially his rants. You never understood what he was saying, but you loved it.
Klaus Meine did a commercial. I think he probably did these nationwide, and we had WQFM here in Milwaukee, and that was like, they didn't play all metal, of course, because we didn't have an all metal station. I think Chicago did by the mid 80s, but they played a lot of hard rock and they played a good bit of metal. And so they had Klaus Meine getting on and being like, hello, Milwaukee, and then he'd like say something about QFM, and there you go. Andy's like, rock you like a hurricane, Milwaukee. You couldn't figure out what the hell the guy was actually
It's rock
saying,
you.
It sounded cool,
It's rock you like a hurricane.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he would yell it. So, but like, I never understood on Worldwide Live what he was saying half the time, but I was so excited, it was just, yeah.
Yeah.
It was, well, that's it. That album's probably in our top 10 together, I think, right?
Worldwide Live? Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now there's one other like glammy band that we should mention, and this one's got a connection to TNT. So it's called Tin Drum, and it was formed by this guy Morton Dahl. When he left TNT, he was the drummer, so that's why it's Tin Drum. And they actually had a female singer. And they've got 2 albums, Drums of War, How About This, 88, 89, probably heavier than TNT, I would say, but still within that kind of, is it metal? Is it hard rock? Kind of a questionable spectrum. And then we get some thrash metal bands. We have Witchhammer, which is formed in 86. And they toured around with these other bands like Arch and Tin Drum. They didn't actually produce any albums until 1990. So they're part of the scene, but they're not having the kind of impact that an album does. But then there's Equinox. They form in 87. And they put out 2 albums, What the F Is This in 1988, and then Auf Wiedersehen in 1989. So that's, it's showing there's a variety there. But of course, what is Norway known for? Black metal, right? And black metal does get its start in the 80s. So we have this band Mayhem that's formed in 84, and they start doing cover songs by Black Sabbath and Venom, Motorhead, making their own music. And Scott and I were joking about this before we started about metal is transgressive. Certain kinds of metal are more transgressive than others. So, you think about the names of songs, bands, albums for black metal or death metal. This is a great example. Their demo is called Pure Fucking Armageddon. So, that kind of sets it going. Yep. Then they release an EP, Death Crush. And this is pretty important for the early Norwegian black metal scene. And then they hire this guy who's a Swedish guy from Morbid, Per Dead Olin, who's wearing corpse paint and popularizing that. And they do weird stuff on stage. The Dead is cutting himself on stage, and not Gene Simmons spitting blood or something like that. This is a guy actually cutting himself. They would impale pig or sheep's heads on stakes at the stage. Now, of course, Wasp was throwing live meat out into the audience for shows. Yeah. That's not totally unknown, but that's important. There's another band called Old Funeral that gets formed in 88. Their demo is called The Fart That Should Not Be. sounds like a reference to
typo negative.
Well, I was going to say The Thing That Should Not Be, from right, which is a reference to H.P. Lovecraft. Then we have Dark Throne. They're formed as a death metal band originally called Black Death, but then they'll transition into a black metal style later on. Another band, Mortem, starts in 87, starts as death metal, then becomes black metal. They have an offshoot band, Arcturus, where some of the members do side projects. Another important one, Stigma Diabolicum in 89. They changed their name to Thorns. They release a bunch of demos. And I should actually have said, so it's not just band names, band albums, songs. It's also the names of the people involved that often signal this transgressive quality. So they're members of Stigma Diabolicum are pedophagia, child eating, coprophagia, crap eating, fetophagia, I'm not even sure what that is, and Harald Eilertson. So he doesn't need a crazy name. And then, we have, of course, in the 90s, the black metal scene is just going to take off. And somebody who we should mention is Varg Vikernes, who, begins playing in 88 with this band Kalishnikov, which later gets called Uruk Hai, and eventually is going to, morph into other projects. He's the guy who is, going to get arrested for killing another performer, for church burnings and things like that. So we've got to really, and we're seeing bigger and bigger scenes, right? We got the Danish scene, we got the Finnish scene, we've got the Norwegian scene, and then right in the middle of all of them, we have Sweden. And Sweden is kind of a deeper territory. It's got earlier origins to the metal scene in the 1970s. There's this psychedelic band, November, that begins to play faster and heavier than the rest of the bands, sort of like what's happening in Great Britain or in the United States or in Germany. And they released 3 albums between 70 and 72. They get some international popularity. They tour the UK, then they disband. There's another band called Neon Rose, which picks up where November leaves off, and they start going more into progressive rock. You might think about what happens to Spinal Tap about 2/3 of the way through the movie, where they're doing jazz fusion. But then we get this band Heavy Load. That was somebody had mentioned that a little bit earlier. Their debut album is in '78, so this is the time when we're seeing other bands rising in LA. Arguably the precursors of the new wave of British heavy metal are happening at this time. And they're, the major influences in the '70s are bands like Deep Purple and Rainbow and Whitesnake, also to some degree Black Sabbath. And so people talk about this time as the very beginning of the first wave of Swedish heavy metal. So Heavy Load formed in '78. You've got two brothers who are the core of it. They released this debut, Full Speed at High Level, in '78. And unfortunately, their record company goes bankrupt, so that slows them down a bit. But they form their own imprint, Thunderload Records, and start releasing more stuff. So Death and Glory, '82, really good record. Stronger Than Evil in '83. Also, not that far from that time, Europe, who we mentioned earlier, right? There's more than just the Final Countdown. And they start out as a band called Force. They start sending out demos to record companies. And here's a funny little bit of trivia. They're told that if they want to get, a deal, they need to, 1, cut their hair, and 2, start singing in Swedish. Either one of them probably would have been a bad move, right?
Yeah, right.
So they start sending out these demos. Eventually, they break through in a different way. They win a televised competition called Rock SM, and then they change their name to Europe, and they take off. Their first album, '83, Wings of Tomorrow, is in '84. The Final Countdown with the famous title track, '86, Out of This World, in '88. And they're, they just start touring, and they're huge,
Oh yeah, they did so well here.
Do you know offhand how far Final Countdown went in the charts?
No.
Way up there. It was played a lot,
I mean, the album itself was high. Jimmy, do you know if what was Final? How big was Europe in Finland? Were they a huge? I mean, they were huge here. But I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, they could command tours. I mean, at first they start out like most doing support stuff, right? But
yep. Oh, Key? Oh wow, that guy's an unbelievable. No, Key was on Out of This World. He was a guitarist on that album. He's a total beast. I remember when that album came out, thinking, "What is this guitar?"
Yeah.
I mean, John Norm's a complete monster too. It's a great guitar band. I mean, I love the band. I thought the tunes were great, and it rocked.
I mean, this is to go back to this thing that we were talking about before. We often misjudge bands by their huge hit, right? Right. And I'll give you an example of one that Andy and I saw at Summerfest here in Milwaukee a couple of years ago. And I had, it's not a metal band, so I didn't know them very well. They're Uv, right? And it was Modern English.
Oh yeah.
Everyone knows them for that song Melt With You,
That's it.
Which was in The Breakfast Club, I think. It was in one of those
It was in one of those movies, yeah, right.
Yeah. And we went to see them, and I'm open to listening to new stuff, new to me, right? Because oftentimes it's pretty good. Like when we went to see the Psychedelic Furs, I had no idea how heavy they are in concert. I'd only heard their kind of poppy stuff. So Melt With You, it's like their outlier song. It's not what the rest of their stuff sounds like at all. And I was like, oh, these guys are actually pretty good,
Yeah.
I think there's quite a few bands like that. And if you've written off Europe because you're like, kind of weak stuff, it's inspiring, but it's not really heavy. I think their other stuff is is well worth checking out.
Oh yeah, I mean, Girl from Lebanon. That's always in their set. I don't know if that was ever a hit, but I mean that rocks. That tune totally rocks.
Yeah.
They're so it was just such a talented bunch of players. I love the vocals. I love the tunes. I mean, I was always a big fan. But they get a bad rap now, because that's all they know them by. Well, at least in the States, we're a weird breed here in the States as far as pop culture goes.
It probably didn't help that Arrested Development.
Yes.
Joel, the goofy magician brother, used that as his entrance music.
That's right.
Made it seem like this is for posers,
Well, it's like the Beavis and Butthead with the winger shirt.
Yeah, Andy says, Job, it was awesome.
Job, yeah.
Like every magic trick he did didn't work, I think, if I remember right.
Right, yeah. He was they always failed or.
Oh, yeah. So Andrew says, agree with what's said about Europe. I always say, listen to Stormwind, then tell me they're a cheesy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's a good term there. I think people would probably use that term. Well, let's talk about some of the other bands that are coming out. So there's this band Silver Mountain, obviously influenced by Rainbow, Man in the Silver Mountain. They don't really make it. They have a couple albums, but they fold by the end of the 80s. Then you got 220 Volt. That's formed in 79 as well. Interestingly, they get their traction when a radio station in New Jersey starts playing their stuff, which leads to CBS offering them a record contract. And that's off of their first single. So they put out a bunch of good albums, 220 Volt in 83, Power Games in 84, Mind Over Muscle in 85. Then it's a little while before Eye to Eye. And then we actually get to, I'm going to say they're my favorite Swedish band myself, which is Torch. I've been listening to them for quite a while when I came across them. And again, sort of like with Oz, I thought they were a new wave of British heavy metal band when I first heard them. And they, played in a number of different bands that coalesced. I read some interviews with them. They said that they grew up listening to bands like Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Thin Lizzy, Judas Priest, Van Halen. They were inspired by the new wave of British heavy metal. So it makes sense that they sounded like that. And here's a line that I love. Our approach was more is more. And our goal was to become the fastest, heaviest, and loudest band around. I think that's that can be a very good ideal to try to meet up with. You think about Dave Mustaine after he's kicked out of Metallica, he's like, I'm going to found a band that's even heavier and harder and faster than them, So
that's right.
There's a sort of you can only go so far with that, obviously, right? Before you're doing everything at 480 beats per minute. That's not going to work. Right. But it worked. It worked for them. And they've got this album Torch, which had I read a really funny interview about why it was supposed to be a beautiful woman on the album cover, and the artist totally screwed it up. If any of you have ever seen the album cover, you should look it up. It doesn't look like a woman at all. It looks like some crazy, angry blue guy. And they didn't like it. The band was like, no, you got to redo this. But the record company was like, this is perfect. So that's what's out there. And then they released Electricus in 1984. What did them in was partying. They were sometimes called the Motley Crew of Sweden, and not because they shouted at the devil or anything, but because they loved to drink and party. Yeah. And that ended up doing them in. Who knows what they would have developed into, but the stuff that's there is really great. I'd be kind of curious if anybody else has listened to them much, but that's just because I geek out over them. So maybe we should move on. We also have Gotham City. They're formed in 1980 as well. They released some good albums. They've got some good stuff. Another one that I kind of liked was Axe Witch. They're definitely in that new wave of British heavy metal sounding range. They won a contest to record in a studio, and that's how they got their EP recorded. It was not a success, unfortunately, but they then like cranked out albums. 1983, Lord of the Flies, 1984, Vision of the Past, 1985, Hooked on High Heels. And then they kind of run out of steam, like a lot of these bands. There was another one called Treat that's formed in 81. They said that their influences are Whitesnake, Journey, Kiss, and Van Halen. So, they're kind of more glammy. Unfortunately, you might get a kick out of this. They often got compared to Europe. And when that happens, when you like blow away the band who you're being compared with, or you look like a knockoff, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, that's what happened to them. So things kind of went downhill. And then there's a whole bunch of other bands, and I'm just going to run through the names of these without like going through all the stuff where, most of them didn't make it that well. They did manage to put out albums in most cases, and there's good stuff there, but things just did not align. So we have Proud starting in 80, Destiny also in 80, Overdrive that same year, Parasite, Mindless Sinner in 81, Universe, Hiroshima in 82, Spellbound, Madison, and Burn in 83, and then Sad Wings in 85. And all these bands are like creating this milieu, we could say, right? Sort of like a lot of the second tier bands that we would, see albums from in our record stores and sometimes hear on the radio, but they didn't actually go anywhere, right? So I think that's kind of important, though, for creating a metal environment. I don't want to say you should wish that bands should not do well,
right?
What do you make of that, Scott? Or Ken has thought about this stuff a lot, or Jimmy might have something to say as well.
What that a band kind of fizzles out?
It's not so much that. It's that you got to have like enough people trying stuff out, and if they succeed, they succeed. If they don't, they don't. But you think about like the new wave of British heavy metal, lots of bands didn't. They made a couple albums, or maybe they only made an EP, but they were circling around, hitting the pubs, the various places where you could play. People would get excited about them. And I think if you don't have that kind of ballast, it's hard to have a fully developed scene.
I think you're right. We had a lot of bands like Boston, for decades was cranking out some pretty big bands, but the joke in the 80s and even part of the 90s in Boston was, oh yeah, he's in a band. They have label interest. And you just kind of chuckle about that, but it's a band that would do extremely well in the city and people would go see them. And they had an effect on the scene.
Yeah.
People all knew when they were big fish in a small pond, so to speak. And then they might get an album on a major that just would flop, and then you'd never kind of hear from them again. It doesn't mean that they didn't have an effect on stuff. So I think you're right. I think, you need people trying different things, in their own way. And a lot of the copycats didn't end up making it.
Yeah.
A lot of the copycats, we already have that void filled. We already have that. But I think you're right. I think it's important, even if you don't get on the international level. I think if you're doing a lot of good in the local level and drawing a lot of people and making people happy and inspiring people to start bands, that's honorable too.
Yeah, Ken, who has, again, real depth of experience with the new wave of British heavy metal, because he was actually there, writes lots of very talented bands that deserve to have lengthy careers, but for whatever reason, luck wasn't on their side and they faded into obscurity. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, you could look at like, Witchfinder General is a great example of that in the new wave of British heavy metal. And when you read interviews with them, they're like, yeah, we didn't have a clue of what the hell we were doing. It all just kind of broke down, I remember growing up here in this area in the 80s when thrash was really, really taking off. You would go and see a band that would play some Metallica and Megadeth covers, and then they'd slip in some songs of their own, and you'd be like, oh, these guys are great, and you'd buy their demo tape. And then, a year from then, or a t-shirt, you'd be like, where's Ubiquitous? Well, they're not ubiquitous anymore. They're nowhere. Do
you remember back? I mean, this was in a couple instances. Do you remember back in the 80s when Woolworths used to have that big cassette bin? And it was filled with cassettes for 99 cents.
Yeah. Well, and Target had that too.
And I used to buy them.
Yeah.
Because I could afford them. And they were bands that just put out an album that nobody bought. And
it's funny because there were big bands too. So that the bargain rack is where I got AC/DC's Flick of the Switch. An album.
Oh, the cutout bin. Yes.
Yeah. They'd cut like a little notch in it. I don't know what the hell that was for. And that's a great album, but it didn't get traction, right? People are like, oh, it's not as good as Back in Black.
Right.
I got when we were on spring break in 1985 down in Florida, first time I ever went in a Walmart because we didn't have those up in Wisconsin yet. And same thing, bargain rack. I got Judas Priest's Sin After Sin and Black Sabbath. We Sold Our Soul for Rock and Roll, each for $1.99, And I was like, holy shit, this is great stuff, So yeah, there were a lot of those sort of things.
And it happened with like I would even buy bands I'd never heard of
because it was $1.99 or 99 cents.
Like 99 cents or $1.99. And sometimes I was like, this is amazing. But it was a band that did well, and then they didn't sell. So their first album, they were done. And but some of them I used to listen to a good amount. And then I started to like think, do I remember the name of that band, and look up to see if there's any history on them. And a couple of them, there was almost nothing about them. So it's kind of like what we're talking about.
It was so hard to acquire information back then. Yeah. I mean, if it wasn't being talked about in the music magazines, I don't know where you would actually go. If you lived, if you didn't live in New York City or LA or someplace like that,
right?
Maybe Chicago, you probably had a depth of knowledge there.
Yeah.
But I'm going to shift topic because we're going to shortly jump into Swedish extreme metal. But here's what I want to get your take on, Scott. So Yngwie, Swedish musician, right? He's a musical prodigy. He's already recording a demo when he's 15. He comes to the United States. Mike Varney of Shrapnel Records brings him to play on Steeler, and then he plays in Alcatraz in the early 80s, and then by the mid 80s, he's doing solo albums. So Rising Force, Marching Out, Trilogy, Odyssey, those are all from like 84 to 88. He's a Swedish musician. Do we consider his Rising Force a Swedish band, or are they more like Rainbow, where it's an international band? I mean, Richie Blackmore is a British guitarist, but he hires guys from everywhere to play with him. And I kind of get the idea that Malmsteen is doing that too.
I mean, Yngwie, when he was 18, moved to Los Angeles, and he's been there ever since, I think.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you wouldn't consider it to be part of the Swedish music scene, right?
I think it is, in the sense that, he's one of the, even now, like what we call European metal guitar players. he brought his vision and ideas, and then he got LA guys to play with him. I think that's like all of his singers were from Los Angeles.
So you could say it's like a Swedish colony in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I would say it was like he came from Sweden and he brought his European metal and his ideas with him. He was, I mean, he definitely had his thing. I remember, an older sister's handed me that album, the Rising Force album, and I'd never heard of him. She said, "You want to listen to this, even if you don't like the music, you're going to be impressed." And you know, people thought he sped up the tapes back then. But you know, I saw him giving a masterclass in Sweden, and he kept apologizing because his Swedish was so bad. You know, he said, I haven't spoken Swedish since I was like 15 years old, he would say.
Interesting.
But I mean, he sounded fluent to me. but yeah, I think you have a good point, because you do have the Los Angeles musicians as part of the sound.
Yeah.
You know, when he gets his band together.
Gets his band together. I kind of wish we had Harold here as well, but I'll ask Jimmy. What do you think? Should Yngwie? I mean, he's definitely a Swedish musician. Is his stuff Swedish metal? Should it qualify as that, or broader Nordic metal?
That's a good question great one for Jimmy. He's still here.
How's he regarded? You know, that's an interesting one.
Yngwie is his own genre. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, well, it's sui generis. Yeah, that's
because you know he brought his thing here. You know, and you know he was definitely post Richie Blackmore, but you know when he joined Alcatraz, it was like what is this? You know, and he was young and on fire, and he had a bad attitude. It was just great. You heard it in his playing.
That's an interesting observation. Plays violin on guitar. Yeah. And it is interesting that we brought up Richie Blackmore, right? Sort of just out of the blue, because he's somebody who says, I'm not that interested in blues, really influenced by classical music. That's where my core is. And I think you can say that for Malmsteen too, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. He definitely, you know, he did a clinic at Berkeley, but he's not very forthcoming about what he does, because he claims he never practiced, but he calls something else practicing. We're not sure what that is. I'm not sure if he worked on Paganini pieces. I mean, sometimes it sounds like he was exposed to Baroque music and maybe Paganini harmonically, but I don't know, because it's kind of like his way of playing guitar is kind of his way, a lot of patterns and stuff but he definitely, I wish he was much more in depth about talking about, you know, what it is he spent his time doing. But I mean, it's clear that he's aware of Bach. I mean, it's very clear.
Who isn't? To some degree.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, musically, like you'll hear some of the progressions, and you hear some of the Baroqueisms and stuff. So, you know, if he would just say, "Hey, I worked on the violin sonatas a lot," it makes sense.
Jimmy says he heard Bach and it changed his life. Yeah.
And Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah. Well, let's shift gears and talk, as we're gonna wrap up, about black metal and death metal. So we have Bathory, really massively influential band, formed in '83, and their early work is got that distorted lo-fi recording feel to it. The vocals are, you know, harsh, and there's screaming going on. They stopped performing live in '85, but they put out albums. They've got their debut in '84, the return in '85 under the Sign of Black Mark in '87, Blood, Fire, Death in '88, and they'll influence all sorts of other bands. Then we get Mephisto, and they're a band originally called Torment in '84. And they, you know, bring on a singer who's got a really deep, harsh vocal style that's similar to Bathory and Venom. they managed just to bring out some demos, but they influence other people. They're going to disband by 87. And then we get Candlemass, and now we're kind of going in a different direction, right? Because this is doom metal, and they're part of what makes it called doom metal, right? Because their 1986 album, Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, gives what you need sometimes is a catalyst that like helps you say, yeah, this is what we're doing here. I don't think there were bands obviously like St. Vitus and Witchfinder General that are doing doom metal like what Sabbath had done, but nobody was calling it that at the time. So you need somebody like that to bring it together. And they go through a lot of lineup changes, but they put out, a good body of work. 4 albums in 4 years from 1986 to 1989. And then we get Morbid, and we've already talked about them a little bit because this guy, Per Dead Olin, is the founder until he's going to leave. And they, like a lot of these others, they only release some demos, but the demos circulate around and have an influence on creating the death metal scene that's there. We get another one that is going to go through some changes. Treblinka, they're formed in 87. They release some demos in an EP. Finally, they release an album in 89, and the band is going to split up. And then what's left of it becomes Tiamat, which does, more clearly death metal stuff, symphonic stuff, and then shifts to gothic metal. We have this band Carnage, another death metal band formed in 88. They release some demos and then an album in 89. And then we get towards the end of the decade, we get what's called the Big Four of Swedish death metal: Grave, Entomb, Dismember, and Unleashed. And so Grave is 86, Entombed is 87, Dismember is 88, Unleashed is 89. And they're not releasing a lot of stuff in this time. They're going to be doing it later, but they're the ones that, they've got staying power, you could say, right? And so death metal becomes like a massive part of the scene for Sweden, which it still is today. And where did the death metal come in? It wasn't originally from Sweden. These guys are taking some inspiration in part from bands in the United States, particularly like in Florida, but they're doing their own thing with it. And this is how like an entire, what would you call it? Not just scene, but new musical genre is evolving and developing. And, the story that we've told so far is sort of like the prequel to what happens in the 90s and 2000s all the way down to the present. But I think it's useful to think about these early years and how diverse the musical scene is. You've got these AOR kind of bands. You've got these new wave of British heavy metal sounding bands that are, Danish or Norwegian or Finnish or Swedish. You've got glam bands. You've got extreme metal bands, and they're all part of this developing cohesive scene that, in the 70s didn't have much traction, but by the 80s is really chugging along strong in a way that will survive the downturn for the fortunes of metal that are happening, in the United States and Britain in the 90s.
Yeah. That was a big change. That the 90s, at least here, shifted everything. Well, it was the influence of MTV. They renamed everything, they would take what they were, they would take rock that they were promoting, and then they would just name it something derogatory like hair metal. And then this grunge is real music. It's really soulful music. It's,
That's an interesting point about it, right? Grunge was positioned as being like more authentic,
yes,
less produced. And
It's
extreme
actually
metal,
more produced.
yeah. I mean,
That's the
true.
funny part is it was actually more produced.
Yeah, but that's one thing where extreme metal can like respond and say, well, we're not doing that. We're doing this stuff that's tougher and harder and heavier, and we're going to sing about like guts, and we're going to put on the corpse paint and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Ken says same in the UK. It was almost like the entire UK scene shrank considerably after Judas Priest's Painkiller. Yeah, I mean, you read like interviews with bands like Raven or Saxon, bands that never stopped producing albums and touring, and they're like, yeah, those years were tough. Even Iron Maiden, was not selling like they used to,
I think they were playing clubs during that time, if I'm not mistaken, like maybe bigger clubs, but they weren't selling out arenas.
Yeah.
For a while. They're back to doing that, but that's the Blaze Bayley era, I think.
For Iron Maiden, yeah. And then, you also had Tim Ripper Owens. I mean, this is sort of a bit of a tangent, right? It's not as if you can't replace a singer in a band, especially if the band is pretty cohesive. But when you have a singer like Bruce Dickinson or Rob Halford, I don't know. That's pretty tough to replace. I mean, even like Saxon, right? Could you take Biff Byford out of the equation and I don't know, swap in some Saxon cover band guy? I don't think so.
It's but I would have said that about Journey, and I still think I think the singers that they got are amazing, but to me it's if it's not Steve Perry, it's not Journey.
Yeah.
Or Neil Sean. Like you gotta have at least those two guys. But they continued on and they go out and play the hits, and Neil Sean's amazing. He's worth seeing. But now the last question is, can somebody replace Neil Sean and it still be Journey?
I think about two other bands that come to mind right off the bat. So, Udo left Accept in the mid 80s and went off on his own. And he's great in concert. We've seen him play. He's a lot of fun. And we've also seen Accept with, I'm blanking on his name, and he's definitely not Udo, but he's good, and the albums that they produced after that are pretty good, but it's never going to sound like Balls to the Wall or
right.
Fast as a Shark is the song, Restless and Wild.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about Queensryche, right? And I think you're going to differ with me on this, Scott. So, Tate is a great singer. He also can't get along with his former bandmates at all.
Right.
And the guy that they've had, I think now at this point has had a longer tenure in the band than Tate ever did. And when you see him live, he is so close sounding to Tate, you almost don't miss him,
He's a great singer.
Yeah. Whereas like with going back to like Tim Ripper Owens does not sound like Bruce Dickinson, right? It's a different sound.
Which sometimes it could be preferable. Like at least you're not trying to get
Blaze.
Yeah. No, I know. Yeah.
I got him two guys mixed up. Yeah.
No, that's I sometimes I think that's for the better. It's like, look, we're actually on a new direction here because we can't replace so and so. I mean, you can always find somebody to imitate somebody else. Like who's the guitarist that replaced Warren DeMartini? I mean, he was like a Warren, or was it George Lynch? And he was like a George Lynch clone, which it could come in handy then, I guess. But like, it's still not George Lynch, but it's like they try to get somebody that sounded like George Lynch.
Yeah, I mean, like Tommy Thayer and Ace Frehley, right? I mean, Tommy Thayer is a better technical musician, I think,
right,
than Ace, and he was his guitar tech. And when Ace was too high to play, I wasn't sure if he could actually step in and do it. However, he's not Ace.
He's not Ace. I mean,
Yeah.
and you could tell, like, the playing, Ace's playing is so unique.
Yeah.
You know, just his time and how he played things, like it or not, it's Ace. But you know, then the band has to decide, are we going to go on or not? You know,
yeah, which is in some respect a actual musical decision, but I think for a lot of these guys is essentially a business decision. Are they going to continue feeding their families by going out on tour and making records and stuff like that? So coming back to like what we've been talking about here with these different bands, I mean, a lot of these bands are still out there playing, doing great work. Some of them with very different configurations, but that's, you know, we could say that about any band these days that's started out in the 70s or the 80s. And a lot of them have just kind of gone by the wayside, but we're very, very fortunate that we live in an era where we have access to their music. We can go on to YouTube for some of these bands that we don't even have in Apple Music or Spotify or whatever other streaming thing, and we can listen to their stuff because some guy who was excited about them took his, you know, 45 from a single or the EP or LP, recorded it in decent fidelity and put it in YouTube, and YouTube hasn't taken it down yet, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's pretty amazing that we're able to access all of these bands. I know if it wasn't for like Apple Music, I wouldn't have been exposed to Torch or Oz, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, admittedly, though, it wasn't Apple Music then, it was iTunes back then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yep.
So before we wrap up, because we've been going for quite a while, any thoughts from our participants about this stuff? Any things you want us to read, react to? Scott, any last words from you about this?
You know, prepping for this was educational because like I said throughout, there's some bands that I said I did not know that they were from, you know, I thought they may have been an LA band or may have been a British band or may have been, but I didn't realize some of these bands, and even some of the newer ones that Jimmy had mentioned, like Children of Bodom, I didn't realize. I'm not sure where I thought they were from, but I think it was it'll put things into more perspective for me as far as a sound, as far as this, like something coming out of a certain place.
You know, it's interesting. You know, the Nordic countries don't have huge populations compared to, like, say, the United States or Britain, right? But they're massively represented in the metal scene. And I wonder, like in the 70s and 80s, maybe 1% of the bands worldwide would be from the Nordic countries. I wonder what the statistic, if like just crunching raw numbers, would be today. Would it be like 20%? You know, there's a good chance if you run into a new band that, you know, is heavy and hard and harsh, you know, there's probably a good chance that they're from one of the Nordic countries, you know?
Yeah. Very interesting about the essence of a band. If the singer of the debate, I'm reading Andrew's comment. I prefer Dio over Ozzy. It's interesting that some singers have the essence of a band over other factors.
Yeah.
That's a good point. That's well said, actually.
I will admit I prefer Dio over Ozzy as well, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. You know, I do too. You know, but you know, it's also the essence part. I wouldn't. I know there's two eras we could talk about over different things, even like Rainbow. But you know, who has there's one that you think is better, and there might be a different answer for who's got, in this case, the essence of the band.
Yeah.
And then Ken one other point. Lots of Scandinavian musicians deserve far more recognition. Oh, Uli John Roth. Oh my God. Yes. Should be seen alongside Iomi Blackmore in terms of skill.
Well, I
Yeah,
definitely agree about that.
Yeah.
I think he is underrated. I think he's German though. I don't know that he's Scandinavian, but we could talk about, you know, some of these bands and their oftentimes band leaders, you know,
Yeah.
and their contributors in terms of their skill. I mean, Yngwie Malmsteen, I think we don't have to like recognize him any further. He gets enough recognition.
Yeah, right.
But,
He's got, but
yeah.
no, Uli's definitely, I consider him a legend. You know?
Yeah, I don't want to trash Matthias Jobs, but man, the stuff that Roth could play and the effortlessness when you watch him doing it, that he did it with, I think, you know, the Scorpions moved to a more accessible sound with Matthias Jobs.
Yeah, and he's a wonderful player.
Yeah, yeah, but he's not Uli John Roth, that's for sure.
Who's also very unique.
Yeah,
the way Uli plays, very, very, very much himself. You know, when you listen, it's like it's everything about the way he organizes pitches, the way he plays his sound. It's very unique.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because we've looked at him quite a bit in the past, and the person that he says is like his hands down number one influence is Jimi Hendrix. You know.
Oh yeah.
So,
and I think that's the sonic part of it. You know, what went through his soul, because he's kind of a spiritual player himself. So
that's right. Yeah. And Ken was saying would recommend Rock solo band Electric Sun. Yeah.
Yeah, I have that one. I got that in the cutout bin.
It's kind of sad when you think about these cutout bins, right? Because it was great for us to be able to get stuff and not pay $7.99 a record for it,
right?
And then later $9.99, right? But it's also a sign of the undervaluing of these bands and these artists by the music industry. You know, that the fact that the stuff would just be over there for $1.99 or 99 cents. You know.
You know, yeah, that was the thing. For 99 cents, I would pick a band I'd never heard of.
Yeah. I sometimes, you know, conversely, you would have like the metal imports like section in a record store, and those always cost more. So I didn't usually buy them. You'd look at them and you'd be like, "Oh, this looks really cool, man," and it'd be like $11.99, and you'd be like, "Well, that's a lot of money for me at the time."
Yeah, right.
You know, I'm not gonna get this.
And it's an EP, right? It's like
in some cases,
yeah.
And you don't know who the band is, so you know it's got cool cover art and the name sounds cool, but you don't really know. You know, it's hard to take a chance. The kind of record stores I would go to, it's not like they were going to say, yeah, you could like take it out of the package and give it a listen over here.
Yeah, well,
like, are you going to buy that, kid? If not, get the hell out of here. You know,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, we should wrap up. So thanks to everybody for your comments. A lot of good discussion here. We managed to cover a rather ambitious range of stuff. A lot of research did have to go into this. The research was quite pleasant because we got to listen to a lot of new stuff and, you know, like re-listen to some older stuff. So we'll call it a day. Thanks to everybody. You want to have the last word, Scott?
No, what I said before. It was a great journey and a great kind of awakening to some groups that I wasn't giving credit as far as where their origin was. So that was really cool. That was really cool for me. It was educational.
All right. Well, we'll see you all.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining.